Hello ladies and gents. In the previous video we added more input fields for our new products, but the input fields look very cumbersome like this. So now let's create a simple form control for a better UI. So we go back to our view code, and first I'm going to define a new namespace, and I'm going to name it form. And it's sap.ui.layout.form, because this is where the simple form control resides. And at the top of this VBox here, let's create our simple form. And for now I'm going to add just a single attribute, which is named layout, and I will set it to responsive grid layout, and we will see why in a second. The aggregation for the simple form we're going to use is named content, and since this aggregation also belongs to the simple form control, we have to again use the same namespace. We begin with form and say content. Now in order to begin a new row for our form, we have to create a label control first. So I say label, and it has a text attribute. And let's begin with our product name here. So I'm just going to copy this product name as the label text. And the next control in the row is going to be our input control here. So let's move it up. And we no longer need the placeholder because we have a label now. And we also don't need these stylings here because it's going to be managed by the simple form control. Let's make this a single line. And next we have the category combo box. So let me duplicate this label. And text is category, and then we have the combo box as the control. Another label. For the price. Also, let me remove the placeholder for category as well. Price, let's also move up and remove the placeholder. And lastly, two more labels. First one is for the release date, second one discontinued date, and let's move up the controls as well. And we're done. Now we can remove this empty VBox. And what I also want to do is a small change to style our button here, by giving it a type of emphasized, so it stands out a little bit more. We save and check our application, and now it looks much better, but we immediately realize something, that the labels are not aligned with our inputs, and we can fix that quickly. We go back to our simple form and add another attribute. Let me actually split this into multiple lines. And the attribute is editable, which we will set to true. Now this is not going to magically make any form editable, it's just for styling purposes. And if we go back, now our labels are nicely aligned with our inputs. And about the styling of the simple control, the default behavior is, imagine this whole form control being split into 12 equal columns. And we can specify how many columns the labels are going to take, how many columns the inputs are going to take, and also we can leave some of the columns empty. And if we make our screen smaller, we have a few breakpoints by default, and as you can see, around 600 pixels. We see that the labels are on their own rows and inputs are on their own rows, which means the labels are taking all the 12 columns as well as the inputs. Now these breakpoints we can also change, but I'm just going to set the default ones as a reference. And let's begin by breakpoint M, which is by default 600 pixels. So after 600 pixels, it's going to apply the medium styling. Next one, breakpoint L for large, and by default it's 1024 pixels. And lastly, we have a breakpoint for X large screens, which starts at 1440 pixels by default. Now if we check our application again, it works as the same. But if we make our screen larger, we see that our inputs are unnecessarily long. So let's add some empty columns. Let's say we split it in the middle. So let's leave 6 of the imaginary 12 columns as empty for the large screens only. And how we can do that is we can say empty span. Let's begin with medium. And for medium screens, if we check, it's somewhere between here, and it actually doesn't look bad. So I'm not going to set any empty spans for the medium size. So I will set it to 0. Do I have a typo here? Empty span. Yes, span should be uppercase. Okay. Next one, empty span large. And as we said, let's set it to 6. And also for the X large screens, we also set it to 6. Now if we check our application and make our screen bigger, now as soon as we get to the large breakpoint, we see that the half of our form is empty, and it looks much better on a large screen like this. And similarly, we can also change the spans of the labels. Well, so let's see how we do that. And we begin with the small screens now. So we say label span this time and begin with an S for small. And as we saw earlier, we wanted to take up all the 12 columns. And label span M, let's set it to 3. Label span large, I will also set to 3. And label span X large, also 3. So nothing much is going to change. We see that labels are taking up a little bit more space. We set them to 3, so we have 6 of the columns empty anyway, and if we set it to 3, the label span, only 3 more remain for the inputs, so it's like half of the remaining space for the labels and the inputs. Next, what I want to do is add another input field next to our price input here, just for the currency. It's not going to be editable for now, but just for demonstration purposes. If we go back to our code, as I mentioned in the beginning, every label control starts a new row. So if we add another input here after our price input, which is not a label input, it's going to be placed at the right of our input. So our price input, to be exact. So let's add another input here and set the value to euro, it's hard coded, and also set editable to false, so it's disabled. And now if we check, we indeed see a non-editable input here next to our price input. And now, seeing as we have a lot of empty space in the large screens, we can actually divide our form into 2 columns. So let's do that as well. I want to keep the first 3 on the left, and then I want to move the dates to the right. For that, we first have to split our form into 2 groups, and to start a new group we have to use a title control or a toolbar control, one of either. So let's use a title control which resides in the core library. So we already have the namespace for it, so we can use it. For the first group, we begin at the start and say core title and set the text property as, let's say, I18 and product details. And let's create it before we forget. And the next group, let me just copy this, we'll start with the dates. So right here before the release date label, and let's simply say dates for this. Also create an entry for it. And the next thing we have to do is specify how many columns we want for which screen size. And we want 2 columns for large and extra large screens. So we add 2 more attributes to our form. We say columns L equals 2. And also columns XL equals 2. We save and go back. Now we have 2 groups, but since we have set some empty spans for the large screens, we don't have enough space for our inputs, so let's fix that as well. Let's go back, and here we set the empty span for large screens to 6. Let's set it to 1, so we have a lot more space. The same for X large. Now if we check, it looks much better. Now we can also see that this discontinued date is wrapped, so let's give the labels a little bit more space. We set 3 span, let's make it 4 for the large and X large. If we check, now it looks much better. We can also specify how many columns a single control should take up using the layout data aggregation. Let's now make use of that to make our currency input a little bit smaller. We go back to our code, and for our currency input right here, it cannot be self-closing one anymore, and the aggregation is named layout data. And inside we actually need something from the layout library, so let me copy the form namespace and remove the form and name it L, short for layout. And what we need here is grid data with a single attribute named span. And the syntax is we begin with X large, and then we specify how many columns it should take. 1 should be enough for very large screens. For large screens, let's say 2, medium 3, and for small I want it to take the whole row, so let's set it to 12. Now we save, go back. Now we see it's much smaller, and if we make our screen smaller, we no longer see 2 groups side by side because we are no longer in the large breakpoint here. So right here, this is not relevant anymore because our screen size is considered medium. And if I go even smaller and smaller, we see that all the labels and the controls, the inputs, are taking up the whole rows basically. Now that would be all for this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.